Okay, I don't know how to open the chat, so if anyone has any questions, please ask. Oh, just kidding. Cool. Anyway, does anyone have any maybe any anecdote to add, maybe any examples of the definitions I've given so far? Totally fine if not. No, yeah, it's fine, Kayla, you can record it.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Kelly, and I think I do have an example that I'd like to share. I think a few months ago, there was a company that decided to, they wanted to sell mahjong tiles, and they wanted to sell it at like an increase, like a super high rate, and they didn't appreciate any of the significant symbolism that it had on those tiles. I don't know if y'all know about mahjong, but it's a traditional Chinese game. And a group of white women decided to change the game to make it look more aesthetically appealing. And they had zero, I felt like they had zero respect for the traditions for that game and the symbolism of that. And I think they faced a lot of backlash. I think that's an example of cultural appropriation that comes to mind.
That's a fantastic example. Yeah, I know another one that I've seen recently is, I don't know if you guys are on TikTok, but on like skincare TikTok, a lot of people have learned about gua sha, which is like using this like jade stone to basically massage your face and drain your lymph nodes. And it has like a very big cultural significance in a lot of Asian cultures, and it's from like it like comes from an Asian background, is where like it was first, came into practice. And now it's being commercialized by like Amazon and Sephora and all these like big beauty industry monopolies without any, without any discussion of the cultural significance. So yeah, that's a really good example. Thank you, Kelly. Anyone else? It's okay. Yeah, there's so many examples that I'm sure we all are aware of. This is a pretty pervasive problem. And the issue with cultural appropriation, in my opinion, is that because like we'll talk about this later, but because there's so much historical oppression of these groups, and now like certain racial groups are picking and choosing the like practices that they think would benefit them, in spite of oppressing the group in general. Like it's just very frustrating, and it's in my opinion like unethical, which is why I added it here. And we'll have a further discussion about it later. But anyway, so that's cultural appropriation. Privilege is also something that we'll talk a little bit more about later, but privilege is basically an unearned social power based on a group that you identify with. So this might be white privilege, male privilege, like able privilege. So like being like not having a disability and, being able to speak or walk, etc. You're afforded different privileges. So yeah, that's privilege. And one other thing that we should talk about is institutional and structural racism. So basically, these are like very long definitions, but basically it just means that there has been a historical trend of racist government policies and racist, like not even government policies, but like media portrayal, and all of like the basically elements that make up society. And all of these elements have had racial tendencies that lead to a portrayal of a certain certain social group that oppresses them over another group. So for example, like we've seen slavery, Jim Crow, redlining. These are all institutional examples of racism. Let me make sure I'm not missing any questions. I am not. Okay, so actually, yeah, let me give some examples of this. So some ways that institutionalized racism can affect like modern society is how we see the effects of African and Native American men compared to white men, right? So because of the historical significance in oppressing these groups, these men are incarcerated at a much higher rate, disproportional to the general population, ratios. They tend to live in more toxic environments, both like in terms of like pollutants and in terms of violence. They tend to have more dangerous jobs, more laborious jobs. They have higher exposure to more lethal situations. They have a higher, even just like stress levels. It's been studied heavily, the effect between race and stress. And these groups have a higher stress level even. So like healthcare coverage, all of these, like for example, yesterday, Arkansas banned healthcare for transgender people in the state. So this is an example of an institute. It's not racism, obviously. It's like gender discrimination, but this is an example of an institutionalized policy that oppresses a group of people. So these words are also thrown around a lot, and people don't really understand what like systemic racism is. So another overview. Okay. So any questions about those definitions before we go into our activity? Okay, no. So when we have our like discussions moving forward, I would love if you guys were able to use these definitions and words in the discussion in order to be more specific with, how these affect modern society. So that's the reason why I gave you the definitions. Hopefully we'll be able to use them. Cool. So now we have an activity that discusses privilege. So if for this activity, if you could pull out a calculator or a piece of paper, you could have just like, you could honestly do it on your hand or have like a running document on your computer. But we're all going to start with the number 10. So everyone is going to have a total sum of 10. And I'm going to read some statements, and if you identify with that statement, then you will follow the instructions. So if I say, if you identify as someone who is above 6 feet, add 1 to your summation. So if you do identify as being someone who is over 6 feet, you will add 1 to your total sum. So in that case, it'll be 11. If you don't, then don't do anything to your sum. Don't do the opposite. Don't do anything to your sum. Okay, let me pull up the activity really quickly and we will get started. Is anyone not ready, or should I pause for a second? I also talk very fast when no one else is talking, so please feel free to tell me to slow down or stop at any point. I will be more than happy to. Okay. And also let me preface this by saying that the purpose of this activity is not to make anyone feel uncomfortable or ashamed of their privilege in any way. The purpose is to recognize that privilege exists, and it is afforded to us in different ways than we may recognize just in a day-to-day capacity. So hopefully we can have a discussion about things we didn't even realize we were benefiting from, and how everyone has different types and degrees of privilege. Cool. So if everyone is ready, I will get started. So everyone start with the number 10. Cool. So if English is your first language, please add 1. If English is your first language, add 1. If either or both of your parents graduated from college, please add 1. If either or both of your parents graduated from college, please add 1. If you have been impacted by divorce or are the child of divorce, please subtract 1. If you have been impacted by divorce, please subtract 1. If there have been times in your life where you have skipped a meal because there was no food in the house, please subtract 1. There have been times in your life where you have skipped a meal because there was no food in the house. Please subtract 1. If you have visible or invisible disabilities, please subtract 1. If you have visible or invisible disabilities, please subtract 1. I guess maybe I don't have to repeat them. If you were encouraged to attend college by your parents and family members, please add 1. If you grew up in the suburbs, please add 1. If your family had or has health insurance, please add 1. If your work and school holidays coincide with religious holidays that you celebrate, please add 1. If you studied the culture or history of your ancestors in elementary school, please add 1. If you have been bullied or made fun of based on something you cannot change, such as your gender, ethnicity, age, or sexual orientation, please subtract 1. If you ever felt passed over for an employment position based on your gender, ethnicity, age, or sexual orientation, please subtract 1. If you were ever offered a job because of your association with a friend or family member, please add 1. If you were ever stopped or questioned by the police because they felt you were suspicious, please subtract 1. If you or your family ever inherited money or property, please add 1. If you came from a supportive family environment, please add 1. If one of your parents was ever laid off or unemployed, not by choice, please subtract 1. If you are a citizen of the United States, please add 1. Couple more left. If you were ever uncomfortable about a joke or statement you overheard related to your race, ethnicity, gender, appearance, or sexual orientation, but felt unsafe to confront the situation, please subtract 1. If your ancestors were forced to come to the United States not by choice, please subtract 1. If you took out loans for your education, please subtract 1. If there were more than 50 books in your house growing up, please add 1. If you ever felt unsafe walking alone at night, please subtract 1. If you are a white male, please add 1. Cool. So hopefully everyone was able to keep up and has a total summation based on that activity. So now let me pull up the discussion questions. Okay, so if we can have several people unmute and just say one word that describes how they feel right now after that activity, despite whatever your total sum is. Anyone?
Feel kind of stressed because there were a couple of statements that have brought up more like recent issues I've been having.
Yeah, that's very valid, absolutely. So Claire feels stressed after that activity.
I felt oblivious to some of the questions that some days I don't really think about thinking. Well, I bet some people do every day.
That's very interesting, yeah. Oblivious, that's very true.
It feels a little bit weird to me. Like I'm feeling a little bit weird because all of this isn't something that we had control over. Like I wasn't asked to be born a certain way. A person who's rich right now didn't ask to be born to that family. But at the same time, like lives are very different. And this isn't something that we can control, but when people don't realize that there is a difference, I don't really know how to put that into words. I hope that makes sense, what I've said.
No, absolutely. It is very strange in general as a concept that, you know, these groups that we're born into influence so much of our experience. It's very true. And they seem mundane until we recognize these experiences. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think it's weird that I guess my privilege has been kind of fluid as I've grown up, that it's, you know, at some points in my life, I feel like I've been extremely privileged, and at other times, you know, I could have subtracted a ton of stuff that I might not have been able to, you know, from the moment I was born. It's kind of changed, and I think that's interesting to think, like, privilege can be fluid, and it's not something that's necessarily inherent from the day you're born. It's kind of based on your situation sometimes.
That's very true. Absolutely. It's definitely, a lot of times privilege comes from things such as our socioeconomic status, which does fluctuate throughout our lives. So that's very true. Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Yeah, that's a great point, Cassidy. Whenever, like the first time that I did this activity, I didn't even realize, you know, having books in my house, for example, and having parents that were college educated was such a big influence in my life. So yeah, definitely. Cool. Let me pull up some more discussion questions. Did anyone think that they, before going into this activity, that they experienced like amount of privilege X, and then after the activity, they realized it was more or less than what they thought, based on the parameters of what I read? If we're all aware, that's awesome too. Cool. Okay, so let's discuss a little bit further based on the definitions that I had given at the beginning of the meeting. So how do we think that this privilege discussion relates to the social identity groups such as gender, race, religion, sexual orientation? Like how do we think that we can draw any conclusions from this activity?
Being like outside of the quote unquote norm can be kind of damaging.
Yeah, can you like further explain like what the quote unquote norm is?
Yeah, I'm speaking purely mostly from like a queer angle, but the norm is cishet. And that norm has been aggressively pushed through the dominant religion in America for a very long time. So, or the dominant colonial religion, Christianity. And so that being not like that, they've kind of drilled it in that it's very dangerous. And we're seeing that right now with Lil Nas X's new song, where he made a very beautiful allegory to being told to be sent to hell. And he said, okay, because he is a gay man, and people reacting to it in a very negative way that are religious. So that's what's very interesting to me.
I love that example. Yeah, that's very true. And it's you know, it's so interesting how different facets of society influence others. So like the majority of like powerful, let's say Americans, like belong to like one religious group, and because of that, certain rights are allotted, like to, you know, like say like abortion or healthcare, or like marriage even, you know. So it is interesting to see how, you know, religion influences policy, to your point. Anyone else?
I feel like not all, like I feel like well, you had mentioned that a lot of this sort of thing, a lot of privilege is kind of compounding, right? That you had mentioned before, and that because like you're white, cisgendered, heterosexual, right? There's that sort of like compounding likelihood of the way that you're able to interact in the world, and so maybe this doesn't have like the place and time here in like this discussion, but what were sort of because everything was weighted equally, was this designed specifically to try to like with that in mind, or no? Because I feel like I don't know, like I feel like my score is too low, if that makes sense. Like I know a lot of people who are like impoverished, or like not impoverished, but like lower class, working class, white Americans who kind of like because they're in their poverty, like yes, that they don't have a lot of privileges in that sense, but they seem to, there's a lot of like taking it out on people of color, where we know with people of color it's heavily compounded. I'm sorry that took forever to get to, but if that makes sense, I'm like, this doesn't seem, the value seems really low given, yeah, sorry.
No, that was an excellent point to make. I totally agree. I think that this activity has been oversimplified. I agree that, you know, a lot of these privileges have different weights. Like for example, like I personally think that like race holds a lot of weight based on like the privileges that you're allotted, as well as like, you know, sexual orientation, and like there's also the, you know, like white passing discussion and like the like cis passing, you know, all of these discussions as well that this activity doesn't take into account, which I'm so glad that you're like making those connections and starting to identify like, yeah, maybe like even if I am afforded this or I have been disadvantaged in this way, there might be other people experiencing a more extreme version. Very cool. Any last thoughts? Anyone want to piggyback off of something that was said? Would love to hear from everybody. I would love to learn from everybody. So
I guess like there are some more things that like I need to be mindful that is actually a privilege to have, and it is also a privilege to like not have to think about what is and what is not a privilege if you think about it. So I'm trying to be more mindful of it.
no, that's awesome. That's like the whole point of the activity. And like, so I think Kelly had mentioned that it was like, she felt very strange and like weird. And that's, I feel, the natural instinct when trying to identify like, oh, I am privileged in this way. Like, for example, like myself, you know, like I come from like an oppressed religious group and like an oppressed racial group, but I'm also very privileged in my family's socioeconomic status, and my parents have afforded me a lot of opportunities that other people in my like racial groups haven't been afforded, you know. So that's where like intersectionality comes in. Very cool. Any last points? Totally cool. Okay, awesome. So yeah, so like I said, I don't really want this to be like a lecture style type thing, but I think it is important to discuss historical significance of, you know, just like historical trends of oppression in order to understand how they influence like modern, you know, modern policies, modern prejudice and racism. So specific to America, I will be spewing off a little thing. So between 1525 and 1866, it was recorded that 12.5 million people were kidnapped from Africa and sent to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade. And only 10.7 million survived, meaning that millions died just in this 2-month journey. And so the impact of this is extreme. To give you some more context, we hear about, we learn about Christopher Columbus in school, but Christopher Columbus never actually came to the continent, or what's it called, the contiguous America, like the mainland part. He landed in on a little island in the Caribbean where there was an ethnic group there called the Taínos, and they were a very peaceful group. They used wooden swords during battle because they didn't want to harm their enemy, like fatally harm their enemy. And there were 3 million people on this island that he landed on. And in the, I can't remember how long he was there for. I think it was like maybe 10 years. And in the 10 years that he was there, he killed millions of people. By the time he and his like posse had left, and within like 50 years of him arriving, all 3 million people were wiped out because of disease, rape, just violence, etc. So he basically annihilated this entire ethnic group called the Taínos from the Caribbean. So that's not something that we learn about in history at all. We learn about it, or at least I learned about it as like a very glorified expedition, right? So so one thing to take away, hopefully, is that we need to re-educate ourselves on a lot of things that we might have learned in a modern classroom setting, because a lot of times they've been watered down and even like misconstrued completely. So anyway, about 10 million slaves were brought here and landed in the Americas. Sorry, my notes are very extensive. I didn't know how long I should talk about this. I guess basically to summarize like everything that I've listed, I think it's important to realize that no matter what we learn about, I am 100% sure that we're never going to understand the extent of the oppression that was experienced in that time period. For example, I learned recently that like African American babies were used as crocodile bait. So slaves would be forced to breed because they were a commodity. So some of these babies were thrown in the South, were thrown into swamps for crocodile hunting, and they were left for dead. A lot of times they were mauled by the crocodiles, or just drowned. And it's disgusting and absolutely vile to even talk about. But that's just like one example of, I'm sure, the hundreds that we never are going to be able to learn about because of how overwhelmingly rewritten our history has been. I know for a fact that slaves were eaten as food. I know that, yeah. Anyway, there were like slaves, like female slaves that were used as basically like sex objects. They were the house slaves, and they were the prettier slaves, and that was their whole purpose in life, according to their slave masters, was that they were sexual objects for pleasure. So anyway, long story short, not to generalize and like oversimplify, but Abraham Lincoln obviously emancipated the slaves, 1863, 1864 Civil War. So after this, we saw Jim Crow for 90 years, which was another example of institutional racism. And after Jim Crow, we saw redlining, which went on for about 65 years. This is another example of state-sanctioned racism. I'm starting to ramble. Does anyone have any like questions or anything to add this far in the history lesson? It's not a very good, there's a reason I'm not a teacher. I tend to digress a lot. No, cool. So just to give you maybe even like a history lesson about me. So my family, my father's family was from Malaysia originally, And in the 1800s, the Dutch and British had colonized South Africa, and they brought millions of slaves over from India and Malaysia and Mauritius. So my father's family was enslaved from Malaysia and Mauritius. They were brought to South Africa. And on top of being, forced into labor and like very, very extremely terrible conditions, my family was Muslim. So at this time, Islam was banned. So the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, was complete. Like if you were caught with it, you would be sentenced to death immediately. So my family couldn't practice their religion, and they were forced into this labor. My great-great-grandfather wrote the first Quran in South Africa by memory, and he was imprisoned. But that book actually is like still there to this day, and it's like the oldest book in existence, the oldest Quran in existence in South Africa, which is pretty cool. Anyway, and then more recently, another example is that my grandfather, back in the 1940s, he wanted to get a business license because he had a bunch of failed businesses, but he couldn't get one approved because his last name, which was Jaffer, was on a ledger that identified him as a South Indian man, and this was basically Jim Crow in South Africa was called the apartheid. And so because of that, he was denied a business license. So he changed our last name to Jafar in order to kind of circumvent the system and get approved. So that's just like one example of, the way that this institutionalized racism has affected me, and like in my name being completely different. Shoot, let me go plug in my computer. I'm sorry, so unprofessional. 1 second. Okay, cool. So does anyone have any interesting talking points or any thoughts, or maybe they have some a historical anecdote that we might not have learned that they'd be interested to share?
I just wanted to go back to the discussion point that we had. I didn't really get a chance to get my words together. The activity definitely opened my eyes a lot because as a male, there are definitely many privileges that I experience that sometimes I don't even realize. And attending talks like this is definitely helping me understand more and basically become a better person. And at the same time, being an immigrant from the Middle East, there are definitely disadvantages also that I do experience and my family experiences. And it was very interesting to see this kind of like the balance of the two, and how I'm kind of from like my score, it kind of felt like I was like in the middle basically, because there were advantages as a male that I was experiencing, but then also racial and basically just based on my like background, disadvantages that I was also experiencing. So that was very interesting for me to see.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I'm glad that the point is somewhat getting across of starting the conversation to recognize our biases and our privileges. Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing.
I actually have a question. I posted it in the chat. Just wondering, for that activity, do you know what the highest possible versus lowest possible score was, so we can just gauge?
Interesting. But you know what? I can actually count right now.
Okay. I don't want you to have to sit and count through it.
No, I'm a math major. I love counting. No, you know what? Let me get back to you about that after the activity. That's a really interesting question. I actually didn't even think about that.
Okay, because I mean, I personally thought that I ranked lower than I expected, but I also have no idea what the comparison is to what the highest versus lowest. So that's what I was just wondering.
No, that's a really good question. I think that the baseline would be like 10 where you started, and I think maybe that's why they tried to make it like kind of equal weights, so that how much from the baseline of 10 is like, net. I mean, it's obviously oversimplified, but like kind of like indicative of how much net privilege like compounded.
Yeah, I got you.
But that's a really good question. I will make a note right now to do that. Well, I know that like a lot of this discussion is kind of all over the place, and it is a very complex topic. Is like privilege, racism, all of this. So I hope that I haven't lost you guys too much with like all these different points to talk about. But anyway, so that was like a historical breakdown, very oversimplified and brief, but. So now that we have like kind of all of this background information as a foundation, let's talk about how we can improve our communities, right? So how do we think we can express our own diversity in both a professional and social setting? Or any of these questions that anyone wants to answer, please. This is basically becoming an open forum.
I think that's something, at least for expressing your own diversity, is trying to take the time to like explore like your own history and exploring the cultures that you're from. Part of my family is like Ukrainian. They were a nomadic group in like the mountains in Ukraine, and because of that, like my family has continued traditions, and I like to share those traditions with my friends, like doing pisanki, which is a Ukrainian Easter egg dyeing. And that's just something that I like to share with my friends and kind of teach them a little bit about that type of culture.
I think that's a fantastic point, Morgan. Is like just like learning about our history and stuff at an individual level. Can you share a little bit more about these Ukrainian traditions?
Yeah. So I don't know that much. My aunt has done a lot more research into Ukrainian traditions. But at least with pisanki, it was typically it was usually around Easter. The girls would make pisanki and they'd decorate these eggs in specific ways that essentially communicated their interests to the guys at their school and whatever, and like in their community, and they would distribute them. That's at least what I know from like a report I did in like 4th grade on a cultural thing in my history. But it's a lot of fun just like looking at the guides and making a message in the egg design right now.
That is so cool. Have you like actually done it with your family?
Yeah, my family likes to do it every year. It's like a tradition we have for Easter. It's like the only Easter tradition we really have is doing pisanki. It's a lot of fun. It takes like the entire day, but and half the time your egg breaks and it's not even worth it, but it's a lot of fun with practice.
That's awesome. Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing. I didn't know about that. That's very cool. Do you, just out of curiosity, do you know like the name of the nomadic group that your family?
Yeah, I believe the mountain range is Rusko-Carpathian group. Like it's a Rusko-Carpathian mountain range, I think.
Okay, very cool. Yeah.
From what my aunt has told me, she's done a lot of research into Ukraine and like folk magic in Ukraine and stuff like that, which is really interesting.
So sorry, how do you say it? Rusko-Carpathian?
Rusko-Carpathian. I think I spelled it.
Oh, interesting.
I think this is it. I don't know. It's Carpathian mountain range in Europe.
Okay, very cool. I'm definitely gonna research that. Does anyone else have any cool anecdotes, cool discussion points?
At least expressing diversity, something that I've experienced in the last 2 years of college in particular, because I'm here in America and ASU who I've seen, at least all the students who I've met and seen are predominantly white Americans, have progressively encouraged me to drink alcohol despite my age. But the part of where my family comes from, Western India, we come from the state of Gujarat. Since Mahatma Gandhi helped make India independent, at least through his peaceful movements, has banned alcohol from that state ever since he has begun his freedom fighting marches. And my whole entire family does not drink alcohol, and it's hard to express to my friends here in America that I'm not even interested in alcohol because of this culture. It's not even just religious, as most of them ask, but also expressing and owning up to your diversities, to stay true to who you are, as well as being open to everyone else.
That is a fantastic point. I think that it's so easy to just succumb to the assimilation that's like kind of projected onto you in these like majority, like one identification group like type settings. So that's super interesting. I didn't know that alcohol was banned in Gujarat. That's very interesting. Like what has your experience been with explaining that to people? Like have they been like more open, or have they been like kind of like, what are you talking about?
Nearly okay, I don't want to generalize all white people because I know a lot of them would understand, but it was mostly the Asian, my Asian friends or Asian students who would mostly like not question like, oh, is it really cultural, or are you just pretending like it is really religious or not? So I do get a lot of questions or little subtlety of doubt from everyone. So it's like, if you don't believe me, you can look it up kind of thing. But yeah, I can't quite pinpoint it, but it's definitely not everyone who would truly believe it because it's so glossed over. Oh, Mahatma Gandhi, yeah, he's the dude who helped get India independence, but there's so much more to that, the aftermath of that. But it's hard to make people understand.
Yeah, I honestly have never thought about that. That's very interesting. I think like one thing I forgot to mention during this presentation was microaggressions too, and how they can influence, how comfortable or how successful someone is in different environments and situations. So that's interesting that you've experienced, maybe like different people from different cultural backgrounds being more or less accepting towards something that's different from their own experience. Very cool. Does anyone have anything to add to that or to also share?
For white people that have like a certain amount of privilege in regards to I think like having people in their family that are educated and stuff like that, and especially people who like consider themselves liberal, there's a lot of documentation out there that you can take a look at and read, especially considering the fact that there's so many that like to one of the questions that was in the questionnaire of being like, were you taught about your history or not? Like you have to make the considered effort to go out and look for the history. And conveniently enough, there's so much documentation now that can help educate you on that sort of stuff. And specifically about racism in America as it pertains to Black individuals. The new Jim Crow is like kind of the standard text for how that developed and how it's still pervasive throughout our society. And then when it comes to dealing with microaggressions, noticing when you microaggress, and then changing the rhetoric with which you talk about microaggressions, especially with people that you love dearly. White Fragility is a really good book for white people to sort of learn and like realize of, oh, that was a microaggression. How do I repair that? and how do I see and approach that in other people and talking to other people. So there's a lot to learn.
That's a fantastic point. Yeah, Lily, I know we talked about like some of the books that you've been reading. So you said The New Jim Crow and White Fragility are good resources.
Yeah, and there's a ton more. Those just so happen to be the ones that I've picked up and read, and both of them have been just super kind of like, you know, I feel bad that I didn't pick them up sooner, and it blows my mind that they're not being like taught in school or anything. But
No, that's awesome though that you're beginning to educate yourself at like this level, you know. Yeah, I think that microaggressions, like we are so used to them, I think at a certain capacity. You know, I like again, sorry to bring up TikTok, but I saw this girl do one like if the roles were reversed. So if like you know, people from like minority groups in America were committed microaggressions to like Caucasians the same way that like minority groups experience them. So it's like if like some girl named Sarah like tells you her name, it's like, oh, how do you pronounce that? Oh, I'm just gonna call you like Sarah. Like, sorry, that's easier. Like, you know, just like small things like that. They really like make a difference with like someone's success in a community, honestly. Because I mean, at the end of the day, like I feel like most people don't want to, most people that we will interact with, like at ASU at least, aren't gonna deliberately intend to like make you feel uncomfortable in any way. But the reason that people do is because of these microaggressions, you know, because of these like small things that we don't even realize that we're doing, like maybe talking over someone or, you know, like explaining what you think that they meant when like they could have explained it themselves. You know, small things like that I think are a really good way to start educating yourself. So thank you, Lily, for sharing those books. I know that we are at like an hour at this point. So if anyone has anything else to add, please feel free. Go ahead. I love this discussion. I would love to continue this discussion at any point. If not, so these are just some next steps that I thought of, and I would love to have like even a brief discussion about next steps. I know Lily mentioned some books that we can read, some books that I would recommend. I'm reading one right now called Dead Aid, and it's about sending financial aid like through supranational organizations like the UN and even like the US government, sending financial aid to developing countries in Africa and how it harms them, because basically the summary of the book is that it's not sustainable long term because it doesn't allow them to like build economies that they can withstand their own like financial institutions. So in like we're basically keeping them in a cycle of debt in the world. So anyway, so there's a huge book list that I can send out after this meeting that I would definitely recommend reading. Another thing is recognizing your implicit biases. So I know that Harvard has a certified test that you can take in a bunch of different categories. So you can recognize your gender bias, your racial bias, you know, like professional bias. And I would definitely recommend taking that because it was eye-opening for me because I thought that I didn't have any racial biases, but I do. And I'm trying like implicit biases that I have to actively work against and try and re-educate myself. And another thing is like calling out people that are in charge, you know, like government officials, people that, you know, make the media that you consume and the sports teams that you can, like any entertainment, any, you know, anyone with any power, calling them out and saying like, hey, this isn't right. Like even your old school districts, you know, like if they're teaching something or they're failing to teach something that is important, like for example, I went to Hamilton High School, and the Chandler Unified School District history curriculum is terrible. It is very whitewashed and like not like productive at all to any progressive society. So there was like a huge push for like a bunch of petitions to rewrite the history curriculum and stuff like that. I think as long as everyone is like making these small steps towards improving themselves, I see no reason why we cannot get to a more inclusive and diverse community. So if anyone has any final steps to add, any advice for actionable items, would love to hear them.
I guess this might go under kind of like educating yourself, but something I've been trying to do more of is diversifying like my social media feeds. I kind of noticed I was following a lot of creators that looked like me, that like I identified with personally. And so I've been like, I don't know, I saw like an Instagram post where it was like, here's some like creators from minority groups that you can follow to like see different perspectives. And I feel like that's been a really great way for me to learn a lot, because to be honest, I'm like not a big reader. I get busy, I forget to finish books. So I'm like, these little things where I can be like, oh, here's a 60-second TikTok from hearing a perspective that I didn't have on my own. I feel like that's been really helpful.
General exposure to other people, other groups, you know. I mean, yeah, like honestly, like I don't think anyone has time to read books anymore. So it's just any way that you like spend your time making an active effort to diversify that. Yeah, through the other thing that I've like really tried to make an active effort towards is buying from small businesses and buying from businesses from that have like a ethnic, you know, like person of color.
Okay, your mic is doing something kind of weird right now. It got like weirdly, your mic's like weirdly crunchy and it's kind of hard to hear you. It just started.
My laptop gets so like annoying. Hear me better? No! Ah! Okay. Everyone calm down. Okay, wait. I don't know how to fix it. So if anyone else would like to add anything, I would absolutely love that. Please take over the conversation. You guys are free to go.
Oh, sorry, I can't really hear. It might be better if you type, but from what I heard, you wanted someone to just start talking about stuff. Something I thought was interesting is how over time, like the groups change that are being oppressed in a way, at least in America, and like and what I know is like Eurocentric stuff, but like my ancestors, they're Scottish and they were Catholic in Scotland, and they had to flee Scotland because England was cracking down on Catholics at the time, and they had to flee to America for religious freedom, which is why Maryland is called Maryland, because it was where all the Catholic Scottish people went. And even like something I remember was from like my history class was along with learning about how African and Asian communities were racist against, for being bad against, I guess. I don't know what's the word. Sorry. Irish people were also stereotyped and not allowed to work and all those things. I think it's really interesting that how groups change, because now no one thinks twice if you're Scottish or Irish. It's now you're just, I think that also has to do with the white passing thing and how white has become the new just general signifier, when it used to be a purely like religion, it seemed like, at least in like Scotland and Ireland and Europe and England. That was something I thought was interesting when I was a kid and learning about like racism and stuff like that. Because like, well, the Irish people, they're fine now. No one cares about Ireland. There's a lot of Irish pride in Philadelphia because where they all immigrated to. But why is there still a lot of issues for all these other groups? Yeah, I can keep talking. I can just keep rambling if no one else wants to jump into the conversation. And then something that I have noticed over the last few years for myself is as I've become more involved with the LGBTQ community and found myself identifying in more ways as queer, I am really on edge on meeting new people that I perceive possibly have ideologies that could harm me for being around them. And that is something I never had to think about before. And I actually get like anxious around some people sometimes that I'm like, do you hate me for existing? Do you think I shouldn't exist? And like, as like a white woman, I do not, or a white person, I've never felt that before. And I feel like that's something that, because a lot of my identities are invisible, that you can only really talk to me to figure it out. That's not something that is as impactful as my life as being a different minority race would be.
Yeah, sorry, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. I think that goes back to the discussion of like, like straight passing, for example, and how you're afforded like some privileges with like not being harassed when you go to the grocery store, and I totally agree. That was one of my implicit biases that I recognized like through that Harvard test actually was that I tend to avoid people that I prejudge to be like potentially like racist or potentially like Islamophobic or sexist or whatever. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Morgan. And the thing about like ethnic minority groups like 100 years ago in New England were like we don't see a lot of that influence anymore, and we don't learn about it honestly as much anymore, but they like are still relevant, like the way that the Irish are currently oppressed by the British in like that part of the world, and we're so like I think still sheltered to a lot of that. So yeah, so thank you for bringing up that's an excellent point. Does anyone have anything else that they want to talk about? I know that we are over time, so you guys are more than welcome to head out. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I know that this conversation was kind of erratic at some points, and that's more indicative of my personality than anything. But I hope that you did gain something from this discussion. If the only thing is that I hope, are going to start educating yourself at a higher capacity. You're going to make an effort to have a more diverse exposure in media and entertainment. You're going to call out your elected officials. There's so many things that we didn't talk about, like the Native American experience. It's like a billion other things that we could have talked about, like the modern like prison system and how that's like basically modern slavery. So please continue to educate yourself. If anybody would like to have a discussion with me about this at any point, please feel free. We can have a little book club. We can have like a little documentary club where we can watch like, educative. Oh my God, it's so late, guys. Anyway, thank you for coming. If anyone has anything else to add, please feel free.
If you want to start a discussion, I think there was some type of Slack channel available. I don't know if it got archived or not just because nobody was using it, but it may be something to look into existing Slack channels to see if there's something there.
Yeah, I know that Cassidy, I think you and Rhiannon had like started a book club, I think, or I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, I feel like we started a book club and then I did not follow through with it because I'm bad at keeping up with reading.
No, yeah, I totally understand. Yeah, even if it's just like, hey, everybody watch this like documentary this week, or everyone watch this TED Talk. Yeah, that'd be very cool. I will definitely send out like these slides and resources that I found to be helpful, book list, documentary list, and that Slack channel. So feel free to join. I'll post a little thing in general too about it. But yeah, thank you so much for coming, everybody. I appreciate it.